The first section of the book, The Road to Serfdom, comprises prefatory and editorial material that frames the core text, providing context regarding the work's historical background, publication history, and evolution across several editions. This volume is specifically designated as Volume 2 of the collected works of F.A. Hayek, the definitive edition. The prefatory material is divided between contemporary editorial commentary written by the volume's editor, Bruce Caldwell, and historical prefaces and introductions written by F.A. Hayek himself for previous printings of the book. Part 1. Editorial Foreword. This part provides background on the scholarly series of which this book is a part. It notes that the founding general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek was W. W. Bartley III. The current editor, Bruce Caldwell, explains that this specific volume is the first to appear under his general editorship. The text selected for this definitive edition is based on the American edition of 1944. This choice was made because the American text was accordingly clearer, as it replaced phrases like "this country" referring to England with "England." Caldwell justifies the subtitle, noting that The Road to Serfdom is unique among his works for having gone through numerous editions, including those in 1944, 1956, 1976, and 1994, each requiring new introductory material or commentary. Part 2. Introduction by Bruce Caldwell. The editor's introduction details the origin and trajectory of The Road to Serfdom. The book began as a short memo written by Hayek in the early 1930s to Sir William Beveridge, disputing the claim that fascism was the dying gasp of a failed capitalist system. This memo grew into a magazine article, then a pamphlet, before Hayek expanded it into the book during World War II. The introduction highlights the initial difficulty in publication, noting that 3 American publishing houses rejected the manuscript before it was finally accepted by the University of Chicago Press. The press initially anticipated low sales, estimating perhaps only 900 copies. Caldwell documents how the book became a major hit and cultural icon, largely due to the condensation published in the Reader's Digest, which eventually distributed over 1 million reprints. This fame, however, led to frequent misinterpretations. Caldwell comments on criticisms of the book, including the persistent misreading that Hayek argued the descent into totalitarianism was inevitable. Part 3. Preface to the original editions by F.A. Hayek. This preface appeared in the first British, Australian, and American editions of the book. Hayek is direct about the book's nature, stating explicitly, "This is a political book." Hayek explains that his decision to write and publish the work, despite knowing it would jeopardize his academic reputation and relations with colleagues, was a duty he felt compelled to write because the majority of professional economists were distracted by wartime service, absorbed by the war machine, leaving public opinion on future economic policy guided by amateurs and cranks. He stresses that his arguments are derived from ultimate values and are not driven by self-interest, noting that his socialist colleagues told him he would have a more important position in the planned society he opposed. Part 4. Foreword to the 1956 American paperback edition by F.A. Hayek. Written 12 years after its initial publication, this foreword provides Hayek's reflection on the book's impact. Hayek reaffirms the book was initially written for a very special class of readers in England, specifically as a warning to the socialists of all parties. He contrasts the sober, thoughtful reception in Europe with the volatile, polarized reaction in the United States, suggesting that in America the ideals of central planning were still fresh and more virulent, whereas in Europe there was already disillusionment about these ideals. Hayek uses this section to clarify his terminology, noting that he uses the term liberal in the original 19th century British sense classical liberalism, which is often very nearly the opposite of the term's common meaning in current American usage. He also notes the passing of hot socialism, but warns against the dangers inherent in the policies underlying the welfare state. Part 5. Preface to the 1976 edition by F.A. Hayek. This preface, written 32 years after the initial publication, details the book's long-term influence on Hayek's own career and thought. Hayek explains that the book, which was written while he was primarily focused on pure economic theory, unexpectedly led him into 30 years of work on political philosophy. This later work included major efforts like the Constitution of Liberty 1960 and Law, legislation, and liberty. Crucially, Hayek addresses the widely publicized distortion of his central argument, asserting, "It has frequently been alleged that I have contended that any movement in the direction of socialism is bound to lead to totalitarianism. Even though this danger exists, this is not what the book says." He stated that his work was a warning about possible consequences if policies were not changed. He notes he now feels no longer apologetic, but rather proud of the book. He admits he had understressed the significance of the experience of communism in Russia, which was a wartime ally, and that he made various concessions which I now think unwarranted regarding interventionist policy. Part 6. Introduction by F. A. Hayek. Original 1944 text. This is the original introduction to the 1944 argument, which directly precedes the main chapters of the book. Hayek warns the reader that there is a more than a superficial similarity between the current trend of thought in the democracies and the flow of ideas in Germany during and after the last war. He warns that the world is in danger of repeating the fate of Germany. Hayek makes clear that the developments he describes are not inevitable. If they were, there would be no reason to write the book. They can be prevented if people realize in time where their efforts may lead. The book's goal is to help readers understand the forces that created National Socialism, so that the Allies might better comprehend the ideals for which they were fighting and avert the totalitarian fate. Chapter 1. The Abandoned Road establishes the core premise of The Road to Serfdom, that the alarming political and social trends leading toward totalitarianism were not accidental or the result of sinister external forces, but rather the unintended consequences of pursuing well-intentioned, highly cherished ideas, particularly the abandonment of individualist principles. Hayek meticulously details how modern civilization has moved away from its foundational principles, and sets the intellectual stage for the subsequent arguments about planning and liberty. The chapter begins by reflecting on the common human reaction when civilization takes an unexpected turn toward evils associated with past ages of barbarism. Hayek observes that people naturally blame anything external, such as capitalism, a particular nation's vicious spirit, or an old social system, rather than questioning their own leading ideas. People are determined to believe that the key concepts that have guided social change for the last generation, directed toward greater freedom, justice, and prosperity, cannot have been wrong. The prevailing certainty is that the current global crisis is caused by sinister forces, and not by genuine error on our own part, or by the pursuit of ideals that produced results utterly different from those which we expected. Although the immediate task is winning the war, the values being defended were threatened even beforehand. The external conflict World War II emerged from a struggle of ideas within a common European civilization, and the totalitarian tendencies are not confined to the nations that succumb to them. It is comforting but erroneous to believe that Germany, Italy, and Russia are simply different worlds, rather than products of a development of thought in which we have shared. Hayek argues that the Anglo-Saxon nations England and the United States have been slow to recognize the extent of this change, because they lagged behind most of the European peoples in the intellectual development toward collectivism. While many still believe they are governed by 19th century laissez-faire ideas, the truth is that the course of society has undergone a complete change in the direction of its evolution. For at least 25 years before the specter of totalitarianism, society had been steadily moving away from the basic ideas on which Western civilization was built. Specifically, society has progressively abandoned that freedom in economic affairs without which personal and political freedom has never existed. Hayek says that these two kinds of freedom, money freedom and life freedom, are stuck together, like a pair of shoes. You cannot walk freely if your feet are tied up. This means, if a central authority, the government, planner, controls your economic life, it controls all the means for achieving all your goals. Hayek points out that this descent occurred despite the warnings of great political thinkers like Tocqueville and Lord Acton, who cautioned that socialism means slavery. Now that a new form of slavery has arisen, the connection is scarcely considered. The Nazi leader, who characterized his movement as a counter-renaissance, spoke truly, as it represented a decisive step in the destruction of Western civilization, which Hayek identifies as an individualist civilization. Hayek takes time to clarify the true meaning of individualism, distinguishing it from popular misinterpretations. He contrasts individualism with socialism and all other forms of collectivism, and stresses that it has no necessary connection with egotism and selfishness. The essential features of individualism developed since the Renaissance and rooted in Christianity and classical antiquity are respect for the individual man qua man, recognizing his views and tastes as supreme in his own sphere, and the belief that men should develop their unique gifts. The only word that still preserves the full meaning of this ideal, now in decline, is tolerance. The unchaining of individual energies fueled the marvelous growth of science, particularly where industrial freedom allowed new knowledge to be tested and everything to be tried by anyone willing to risk it. The growth spurred by individualism surpassed expectations, offering individuals, including the working man, unprecedented material comfort, security, and personal independence. This success, however, produced a new sense of power over their own fate and unbounded ambition, leading people to believe that the principles which enabled this progress were now obstacles to speedier change. Hayek summarizes this paradox. The very success of liberalism became the cause of its decline. The essence of liberalism is the fundamental principle that society should rely as much as possible on its spontaneous forces and resort as little as possible to coercion. Hayek regrets that some liberals insisted too woodenly on the crude rule of laissez-faire, which harmed the cause, even though that simple rule was sometimes needed to oppose special interests promoting intervention. As patience for gradual liberal policy declined, there was a shift toward expecting future progress only through a complete remodeling of society. This shift was fostered by the uncritical transfer of thinking habits associated with technological problems, the natural scientist and engineer, to social issues, demanding conscious organization in a sphere where it is not appropriate. Gradual liberal policy is like being a patient gardener. The gardener knows that if you set up the best conditions, the plants will grow strong on their own, but it takes time. The old liberal ideas believed that society worked best if you set up good, fair rules and then let people follow their own dreams, trusting that the good results would come naturally, even if slowly. But after a while, people looked around and saw some problems that the slow gardening approach hadn't fixed yet, and they got impatient. When people lost patience, they stopped trying to just improve the garden slowly. They said, the whole garden is wrong. We need to tear it all up and build something completely new. Think of an engineer or a natural scientist. They build machines, like cars or trains. To build a machine, they must know exactly what every screw, wheel, and wire does, and they must design the whole thing consciously to serve a single purpose. The engineer is in total control. This works perfectly for building things. The problem: uncritical transfer. Hayek says that people started thinking about society and people the same way they think about machines. They thought, if the engineer can perfectly design a complex bridge, we can surely design a perfect society where everyone is organized and directed. They tried to apply thinking habits associated with technological problems to social issues. Society isn't a simple machine with a single purpose. It's made of millions of people who all have different dreams and values. Hayek argues that demanding conscious organization for all of society is inappropriate, because the great efficiency and complexity of modern life is due precisely to the fact that it was not consciously created or planned. When you treat society like a simple machine, you destroy the individual liberty and spontaneous progress that makes a complex society possible. The result of these changes is a fundamental reversal. Society has abandoned the individualist tradition. The question is no longer how to make the best use of spontaneous social forces, but how to replace the market's impersonal and anonymous mechanism with collective and conscious direction toward chosen goals. This approach is exemplified by sociologist Dr. Karl Mannheim, who asserted that we have never had to set up and direct the entire system of nature as we are forced to do today with society. This reversal of ideas coincided with a reversal of the geographical direction of intellectual influence. For 2 centuries, English liberal ideas spread eastward. But from about 1870 onward, the tide turned and England became an importer of ideas. Germany became the source for ideas destined to govern the world in the 20th century. German thinkers like Hegel, Marx, Liszt, Sombart, and Mannheim spread ideas ranging from radical socialism to simple organization or planning. The West imported these German ideas and was induced to believe that its own former convictions, such as the ideals of political freedom and free trade, were hopelessly outmoded or merely rationalizations of selfish interests. Chapter 2, The Great Utopia, explores the intellectual shift that allowed socialism, which was initially recognized as a threat to freedom, to become widely accepted under the guise of promising a new freedom. Hayek argues that this great utopia, the belief that socialism can deliver both prosperity and liberty, is a fundamental delusion that inevitably leads to totalitarian outcomes. The central puzzle Hayek addresses is how socialism, which originated as an openly authoritarian doctrine, successfully displaced liberalism among progressives by aligning itself with the very ideal it threatened: freedom. Hayek notes that the founders of modern socialism were frankly authoritarian. They believed their reorganization of society could only be implemented by a strong dictatorial government and required the imposition of a coercive spiritual power. The earliest socialist thinkers viewed freedom of thought as the root evil of 19th century society. Saint-Simon, identified as the first of modern planners, even predicted that those who did not obey his proposed planning boards would be treated as cattle. To overcome the natural suspicion that a coercive system would destroy liberty, socialism began using the promise of a new freedom. This new freedom was presented as the consummation of the age-long struggle for freedom and the next necessary step following the attainment of political freedom. The plausibility of socialism's promise rested on a subtle but critical redefinition of the word freedom. To the traditional apostles of political freedom, the word meant freedom from coercion, freedom from the arbitrary power of others, and release from ties that demanded unquestioning obedience to a superior. The new freedom promised by socialists was freedom from necessity. This was characterized as release from the compulsion of the circumstances which inevitably limit the range of choice of all of us. To be truly free, the despotism of physical want and the restraints of the economic system had to be broken. Hayek states that freedom in this sense is, of course, merely another name for power or wealth. Since the promise of increased material wealth was often paired with this new concept, the demand for this new freedom became synonymous with the old demand for an equal distribution of wealth. This linguistic shift gave socialists a term in common with liberals, causing few people to notice the fundamental difference, and even fewer to ask whether the two kinds of freedom promised could really be combined. Hayek concludes that the promise of more freedom was responsible for luring more and more liberals along the socialist road. In recent years, Hayek observes, the potential negative outcomes of socialism have been acknowledged from unexpected quarters, as observers have been impressed with the extraordinary similarity between fascist and communist regimes. While progressives in the West still saw communism and fascism as opposite poles, several writers with first-hand experience testified to their common totalitarian nature. Max Eastman, a former friend of Lenin, admitted that Stalinism is worse than fascism, more ruthless, barbarous, unjust, immoral, anti-democratic. Crucially, Eastman concluded that Stalinism is socialism, in the sense of being an inevitable although unforeseen political accompaniment of the nationalization and collectivization that defines the system. W.H. Chamberlain concluded that socialism is certain to prove, in the beginning at least, the road not to freedom, but to dictatorship, and that socialism achieved and maintained by democratic means seems definitely to belong to the world of utopias. F.A. Voigt concluded that Marxism has led to fascism and National Socialism, because in all essentials it is fascism and National Socialism. Walter Lippmann concluded that organized direction leads to uniformity, which is the nemesis of the planned society and the authoritarian principle in human affairs. Peter Drucker is quoted as viewing fascism as the inevitable next step, arguing that the complete collapse of the belief in the attainability of freedom and equality through Marxism forces Russia to travel the same road toward a totalitarian, purely negative, non-economic society of unfreedom and inequality which Germany has been following. Drucker characterizes fascism as the stage reached after communism has proved an illusion. Despite these mounting warnings from Europe, Hayek notes that the majority in democracy still believe that socialism and freedom can be combined. Hayek dedicates the book to the socialists of all parties, because he believes Most of them sincerely desire liberty and would recoil if convinced their program would destroy freedom. The chapter concludes with the central thesis that democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something so utterly different that few of those who now wish it would be prepared to accept the consequences. Hayek's mission in the rest of the book is to expose this connection, laying bare the reasons why the pursuit of the great utopia ultimately results in the high road to servitude. Chapter 3. Individualism and collectivism focuses on clarifying the critical distinction between socialism, collectivism, and planning, arguing that the current political debate is fundamentally about the methods employed to organize society, not the ultimate goals desired by most people. Hayek emphasizes that the means of central economic control are the true danger, regardless of the high ideals they are intended to serve. Hayek begins by addressing the ambiguity surrounding the term socialism, which he argues is responsible for people drifting into things which nobody wants. Socialism is often used to mean 1. The ultimate aims, ideals of social justice, greater equality and security. 2. The characteristic method, abolition of private enterprise and private ownership of the means of production, and creation of a planned economy run by a central planning body. Many people who call themselves socialists care only about the aims, while those to whom socialism is practical politics prioritize the methods as essential to achieving the ends quickly. Many non-socialists also value the ultimate aims but refuse to support socialism because they fear the methods. Thus, the core dispute about socialism is largely about the means proposed, not the universally desired ends. Hayek argues that the method's central planning control can be used for various purposes. Therefore, it is preferable to use the term collectivism to include all types of planned economy, regardless of the end result. Socialism is defined as a species of collectivism. All points of dispute between socialists and liberals concern the methods common to all forms of collectivism. Hayek points out that it was socialism that persuaded liberal-minded people to submit once more to the economic regimentation, which had previously been overthrown because it forced governments to be oppressive and tyrannical. In other words, the very principles of control and regulation that earlier liberal ages fought hard to abolish were brought back into respectability by the promises of socialism. Hayek stresses that the argument is not against foresight or intelligent social organization, but rather how best to achieve it. The argument is between two systems of coordination: liberalism, competition. This method favors creating conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given the best scope to plan successfully. The argument is for making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human efforts. Competition is superior not only because it is often the most efficient method, but also because it is the only method by which activities can be adjusted without coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. Collectivism, planning. This method demands the central direction and organization of all our activities according to some consciously constructed blueprint. Socialists of all parties have appropriated the term planning for this centralized type. Hayek clarifies that his opposition is not based on a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The liberal argument admits that a carefully planned legal framework is required for competition to work beneficially, and acknowledges that the existing rules often have grave defects. Furthermore, where competition is impossible, such as in public goods provision, other methods of guiding economic activity may be necessary. For competition to function successfully, certain actions by the government are both precluded and required. Negative requirements where coercion must not be used. Parties must be free to buy and sell at any mutually agreed price. Entry into trades must be open to all on equal terms. Any attempt to control prices or quantities of particular commodities is destructive, as price changes cease to be a reliable guide for individual action. Permissible regulation. Measures that restrict the methods of production but affect all potential producers equally are compatible with competition. This includes prohibiting the use of poisonous substances, limiting working hours, or requiring sanitary arrangements. The test is whether the benefits gained outweigh the imposed social costs. Likewise, extensive social services are compatible, provided they do not render competition ineffective over wide fields. Positive requirements, where government action is needed. The state must provide adequate organization of institutions like money, markets, and information channels. An appropriate legal system is essential, going beyond merely recognizing private property to defining property rights precisely. Shortcomings in laws like those concerning corporations and patents have undermined competition. The state must intervene where the market system breaks down, specifically where the owner benefits from all the useful services rendered by his property and suffers for all the damages caused to others by its use. This includes public goods like roads and controlling negative externalities like pollution, smoke and noise, or deforestation. The state also has an unquestioned field in performing tasks, in Adam Smith's words, that are highly advantageous to society but where the profit cannot repay the expense to any single individual. Hayek concludes by emphasizing the incompatibility of widespread planning and competition. The modern planning movement represents a decisive shift, as it is a movement against competition as such. The belief that a judicious mixture of atomistic competition and central direction is possible is a mistake. Competition and central direction are alternative principles used to solve the same problem. If competition is supplanted by planning beyond a certain extent, both systems become inefficient, resulting in an outcome worse than if either system had been consistently relied upon. Planning and competition can only be combined by planning for competition, but not by planning against competition. The universal struggle against competition is first leading to something worse than full central planning: a syndicalist or cooperative organization of industry. In this system, competition is suppressed, but planning is left to monopolies formed by the combined action of capitalists and workers in each industry, putting the consumer at the mercy of these groups. This state of affairs, Hayek warns, is unlikely to persist but is the inevitable first result of widespread hostility to competition. Hayek makes it clear that his core criticism throughout the book is directed solely at planning that seeks to substitute for competition. Chapter 4, The Inevitability of Planning, directly confronts the central argument used by advocates of collectivism, the notion that complex modern life driven by technological change and the resulting growth of monopolies leave society with no choice but to adopt central planning. Hayek argues that this belief is a baseless myth, stressing that the movement toward planning is a matter of deliberate choice driven by ideas, not an unavoidable outcome of objective necessity. Hayek begins by observing that proponents of central planning rarely simply state that planning is desirable. Instead, they claim it is inevitable. This belief is actively fostered, a myth is deliberately cultivated, asserting that competition is being spontaneously eliminated by technological developments that society cannot and should not halt. Hayek firmly asserts that this argument is devoid of foundation. The tendency toward monopoly and planning is not the result of objective facts beyond human control, but rather the consequence of opinions that have been fostered and propagated for half a century, until they have come to dominate all our policy. The most frequent argument for the inevitability of planning is the assertion that technological changes have made competition impossible in a constantly increasing number of fields. This belief originates mainly from the Marxist doctrine of the concentration of industry. Hayek refutes this. Monopoly is not inevitable. Hayek cites studies like those of the Temporary National Economic Committee in the United States, showing that the growth of monopoly is not generally due to competition being technologically impossible. Most monopolies arise or are maintained only through collusion or as a result of public policies. State assistance. Anyone observing the history of aspiring monopolists seeking the power of the state to make their control effective can have little doubt that there is nothing inevitable about this development. The German prototype. The actual relationship between theory and practice is clearest when examining Germany, the prototype of this development. There, the suppression of competition was a matter of deliberate policy undertaken in the service of the ideal which we now call planning. Hayek concludes that the intellectual history of the last 60 or 80 years demonstrates that in social evolution nothing is inevitable but thinking makes it so. A second interpretation of the inevitability thesis is that the complexity of modern industrial civilization creates problems too difficult to handle without central planning. Hayek argues that this belief is based on a complete misapprehension of the working of competition. Far from competition being suited only for simple conditions, the enormous complexity of modern specialization division of labor makes competition the only method by which such coordination can be adequately brought about. Central direction is only feasible if conditions are so simple that a single person could effectively survey all relevant facts. Because decentralization is imperative, no single mind can consciously balance all considerations. Coordination cannot rely on conscious control. Instead, coordination must happen through a mechanism that automatically records all the relevant effects of individual actions and whose indications are at the same time the resultant of and the guide for all the individual decisions. This is precisely the function of the price system under competition. It enables people to adjust their activities to others by watching the movement of comparatively few prices. The more complicated the system becomes, the more dependent society is on the division of knowledge coordinated by the impersonal price mechanism. Hayek asserts that if society had relied on conscious central planning for industrial growth, it would never have reached its current degree of differentiation, complexity, and flexibility. Central direction is incredibly clumsy, primitive, and limited in scope compared to the mechanism of decentralization plus automatic coordination, the market. A third argument suggests that new technological possibilities require protection against competition, that is, monopoly, to be adopted efficiently. Hayek acknowledges that in some conceivable cases compulsory standardization might increase abundance in a way that outweighs the restriction of consumer choice. For example, if everyone used the same cheap car, the overall cost might be lower. Even if a temporary gain could be achieved through compulsion, Hayek argues that such instances do not make central direction inevitable. They force a choice: either gain a specific possible immediate advantage by compulsion, or preserve freedom by not obtaining it immediately or by obtaining it later when further technical advance solves the issue. Sacrificing temporary present advantages is the price of freedom. The core argument for freedom is that we must leave room for the unforeseeable free growth. In the long run, even material progress depends on variety, because no one can predict from which of many forms a better service or good may develop. The suggestion that technology compels planning is absurd. While inventions give immense power, they do not force society to destroy its liberty. Instead, modern technological developments make the power a planning authority would possess infinitely more dangerous. Hayek then explains why technical expert specialists are often found advocating planning. The specialist becomes an enthusiast for planning because he finds it difficult to bear seeing things left undone that are universally admitted to be desirable and possible. He is frustrated because his specialized ideal, like magnificent motor roads in Germany and Italy, cannot be fully achieved immediately without sacrificing other, competing objectives. The specialist fails to see that every single ideal can be realized only at the sacrifice of others, a realization that requires considering factors outside his specialism. Technical excellence in one field, like the German motor roads, is actually evidence of a misdirection of resources by market standards, particularly if traffic volume does not justify the expense for peacetime purposes. All individuals are specialists in some measure regarding their own values: the lover of the countryside, the health enthusiast, the motorist, etc. They all believe that their specific aims can be achieved only by planning. However, the adoption of social planning only serves to bring out the concealed conflict between their aims. The most single-minded idealists are united by the ambition for planning. Hayek warns that the men most anxious to plan society would become the most dangerous if they were allowed to do so, and the most intolerant of the planning of others. Hayek concludes the chapter by stating that the economist's plea is for a method, competition, that coordinates society without the need for an omniscient dictator, recognizing that this means retaining some such impersonal and often unintelligible checks on individual efforts as those against which all specialists chafe. Chapter 5, Planning and Democracy, is where Hayek lays out the fundamental political contradiction at the heart of collectivism, arguing that democracy cannot logically survive a commitment to comprehensive central economic planning. Hayek begins by establishing that planning necessarily requires organizing the entirety of society toward a single unitary social goal, which is fundamentally incompatible with individual freedom. He then explains why democratic assemblies are incapable of defining this single goal and how this failure leads to the demand for authoritarian rule by experts. Hayek first clarifies what central planning truly involves: the deliberate organization of all of society's labors and resources for a definite social goal. This aim is totalitarian in the true sense, as it organizes the whole of society and all its resources for a single purpose and refuses to recognize autonomous spheres where the ends of individuals are supreme. The intended goal is usually vaguely described as the common good or general welfare, but these terms have no sufficiently definite meaning to determine a particular course of action. The welfare and happiness of millions cannot be measured on a single scale. It depends on an infinite variety of combinations. To direct all activities according to a single plan, planners must have a hierarchy of ends that is complete enough to make it possible to decide among all the different courses. This implicitly presupposes the existence of a complete ethical code that assigns a due place to all human values. Hayek stresses that no such comprehensive ethical code or complete scale of values exists in a free society. It is impossible for any man to survey more than a limited field, to be aware of the urgency of more than a limited number of needs. Individual effort and knowledge are only an infinitesimal fraction of the needs of all men. The philosophy of individualism is based on this undisputed fact. Scales of value exist only in individual minds and are inevitably partial, different, and often inconsistent. The individualist concludes that people should be allowed, within defined limits, to follow their own values and preferences rather than submit to the dictation of others. Common action, or the formation of organizations like the state, is justified only where individual views coincide and is confined to agreed-upon means rather than ultimate ends. The probability of achieving agreement on action necessarily decreases as the scope of such action extends. Hayek warns that once the scope of government control over the economy reaches a certain point, for example, controlling over half the national income as was true in Germany in 1928, the government's actions dominate the entire system, and the social scale of values must embrace practically all individual ends. When a democracy agrees on adopting a planned economy, agreement exists only on the mechanism, central planning, not on the ends the plan is to serve. This situation is rather as if a group of people were to commit themselves to take a journey together without agreeing where they want to go, with the result that they may all have to make a journey which most of them do not want at all. Planning forces society to produce agreement on everything in order that any action can be taken at all, a task for which democratic institutions are unsuited. The inherent difficulty democracies face in formulating a comprehensive plan leads directly to the call for authoritarian direction. Democratic assemblies are regarded as ineffective talking shops because they cannot carry out the mandate for planning. They are not asked to act where they can agree, but to produce agreement on the whole direction of the resources of the nation. The system of majority decision is not suited for this task, as a majority view on any single detailed plan, of which there are a legion of possibilities, is unlikely to form. A plan cannot be coherently achieved through a legislative process of voting and amending clause by clause, like an ordinary bill. It becomes necessary to delegate the planning task to experts, permanent officials or autonomous bodies, and to take the direction out of politics. Unlike a military general who is given a single, supreme goal, the economic planner has no such single goal and must constantly choose between conflicting and competing ends, the different needs of different people. Since only the experts who know all the facts can decide which ends must be sacrificed for others, they will inevitably impose their scale of preferences on the community. The problem is not merely technical detail. It is that the interests to be reconciled are so divergent that no true agreement is likely. When delegation occurs because the matter cannot be regulated by general rules, but only by the exercise of discretion, the delegated authority is given power to make decisions that are, to all intents and purposes, arbitrary decisions. The inability of democratic assemblies to produce a plan, combined with the belief that planning is necessary, leads to increasingly strong demands that the government, or a single individual, be given powers to act on their own responsibility. This often includes a call for an economic dictator. Hayek refutes the argument, advanced by thinkers like Karl Mannheim, that democracy is safe because it retains ultimate control over the experts or planners. Parliament can only control the execution of tasks where it has agreed on a definite aim, and merely delegates the detail. It cannot control an agency that must choose between competing ends that Parliament itself cannot resolve. The system will tend toward a plebiscitarian dictatorship where the head of government is confirmed by popular vote but possesses all the powers at his command. When collectivism dominates, democracy will inevitably destroy itself. Planning leads to dictatorship because dictatorship is the most effective instrument of coercion required for central planning on a large scale. Hayek concludes with a critical distinction. Democracy is only a means, a utilitarian device for safeguarding peace and individual freedom. The limitation of power is what prevents it from being arbitrary, not its source in the will of the majority. If democracy undertakes a task, like full-scale planning, that necessarily involves the use of power that cannot be guided by fixed rules, that power must become arbitrary power. Chapter 6, Planning and the Rule of Law, serves as a crucial point in the argument by demonstrating that collectivist economic planning is fundamentally irreconcilable with the established principles of liberty, particularly the rule of law. The chapter begins by defining the rule of law as the key element distinguishing a free country from one under arbitrary government. Stripped of technicalities, the rule of law requires that government action is always bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand. This prerequisite makes it possible for individuals to foresee with relative certainty how the coercive powers of the authority will be used in specific, given circumstances. Consequently, individuals can plan their own affairs based on this knowledge, confident that the government will not deliberately frustrate their efforts through ad hoc actions. The goal of this principle is to minimize the discretion granted to executive organs wielding coercive power. The distinction between the rule of law and arbitrary government aligns with the difference between establishing a permanent legal framework, liberalism, and the central direction of economic activity, collectivism. Liberal system, rule of law. The government restricts itself to formulating general rules that determine the conditions under which resources may be used. Individuals are left free to decide for what ends those resources will be employed. These rules are formal rules, meaning they are meant to apply instrumentally to various individual purposes, and they are intended for periods long enough that it is impossible to know beforehand which particular people they will assist or hurt. The liberal system works because legislators are required to be impartial. They cannot know the precise results of their general legislation on specific individuals. Collectivist planning. Planning necessitates the opposite approach. A planning authority cannot bind itself to formal rules. It must constantly decide questions that cannot be answered by abstract principles, such as determining production quantities, for example, pigs or buses, selecting operating mines, or fixing prices. These decisions depend inevitably on the circumstances of the moment and require balancing the competing interests of various people and groups. In effect, the planner's views on whose interests are more important become part of the law, imposing a new coercive distinction of rank upon the population. This difference is elaborated through the distinction between formal rules and substantive rules. Formal rules are analogous to enacting a rule of the road, a fixed code, whereas substantive rules are akin to commanding people which specific road to take. The foundation of the rule of law rests on the economic and moral necessity of relying on formal rules. Decentralization of decision-making is necessary because no central mind can survey all relevant facts. Individuals can only use their localized knowledge effectively if they can predict the actions of the state. Therefore, state actions must be governed by fixed, general rules whose precise individual effects are unpredictable. If the state dictates actions to achieve specific outcomes for specific people, its actions would have to be based on the full circumstances of the moment, making them inherently unpredictable for the individual planner. Hence, the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. When the state foresees the particular effects of its actions, it is necessarily choosing between different ends for different people and cannot remain impartial. Once the state aims at particular, foreseen effects, it becomes an instrument used upon the people for the lawgiver's ends, transforming the state into a moral institution that imposes its own views on moral questions, like the Nazi state, rather than a utilitarian device supporting the development of individual personality. The liberal state. The necessity of deliberate choice between conflicting ends means planners cannot rely on vague moral standards like fairness or reasonableness. When deciding between competing claims, for example, wages for different occupations or investment in different regions, no existing common moral standard or principle of fairness can provide a definite answer, as resolving these conflicts requires a complete, non-existent system of values ranking every want of every person. As planning expands, legal provisions increasingly must refer to what is fair or reasonable, leaving the decision of the concrete case entirely to the discretion of the authority or judge. Hayek suggests one could track the historical decline of the rule of law, correct start by the progressive introduction of these vague, discretionary formulas into legislation. This required discrimination inherent in planning leads to a return to the rule of status. Formal equality before the law is fundamentally incompatible with any policy aiming directly at material or substantive equality because, in order to achieve the same result for different people, it is necessary to treat them differently. Socialists and Nazis consistently protested against merely formal justice, which has no view on how well off particular people ought to be, and championed the idea of a socialization of the law, movements that actively undermined the rule of law. Hayek counters the misconception that freedom is threatened only if government neglects its duty. Laissez-faire, clarifying that state action is necessary but must conform to liberal principles, such as controlling weights and measures or preventing fraud. The real danger is when the state is in a position to frustrate individual efforts. Our point emphasized is that the rule of law is not preserved merely because all actions of the state are legal in the juridical sense. Even if Hitler had obtained his unlimited powers in a strictly constitutional manner, the rule of law would not prevail, because the law gave him arbitrary power rather than prescribing unequivocally how he had to act. Giving the government unlimited powers, even if legally authorized, allows the most arbitrary rule to be legalized, potentially establishing the most complete despotism imaginable. Planning necessitates delegating broad legislative powers to numerous boards and authorities, as decisions must be made for unforeseen circumstances based on non-generic principles. The rule of law, conversely, implies limits to legislation, restricting it only to formal law and prohibiting legislation aimed directly at particular people. The attempt by planners like H.G. Wells to maintain individual rights while endorsing comprehensive planning demonstrates this dilemma. Wells's proposal states that every man shall have the right to buy and sell without any discriminatory restrictions anything which may be lawfully bought and sold, but immediately nullifies this by adding the condition that it must be compatible with the common welfare. Since nearly all restrictions are imposed in the name of common welfare, this qualification safeguards no individual right. Furthermore, rights like freedom of travel or freedom of the press become meaningless when the planning authority centrally controls all necessary means like transport, currency, paper supply, and distribution channels. The more consistent collectivists, recognizing this logical necessity, openly attack the metaphysical idea of individual rights, insisting that a rationally ordered world should contain only individual duties. This intellectual trend toward believing that democratic governments must always have plenary powers in posse, potential full power, leads directly to the totalitarian state. Finally, the chapter notes that economic planning provides almost boundless possibilities for discrimination and oppression. Experience in Central Europe showed that ruthless discrimination against national minorities was achieved merely by using seemingly harmless instruments of economic policy, such as government control over the development of specific industries largely run by those minorities, without violating the formal statutory rights intended to protect them. Planning requires constant decisions of preference between competing ends and groups, forcing authorities to act based on discretion rather than fixed, general rules. This move replaces the rule of law, which requires predictability and impartiality, with arbitrary, substantive direction, inevitably leading toward tyranny and the rule of status. The relationship between planning and the rule of law can be compared to a conductor leading an orchestra. Planning versus setting the acoustics for concert hall, rule of law. A conductor must dictate every note, tempo, and instrument choice. Substantive, discretionary decisions to achieve a unitary vision, whereas setting the acoustics. Formal rules like good property laws or monetary systems creates the best environment where individual musicians can excel and coordinate spontaneously without centralized arbitrary control. Chapter 7, Economic Control and Totalitarianism, asserts that economic control is fundamentally inseparable from the control of all aspects of human life, thereby leading inevitably toward totalitarian governance. The chapter comprehensively dismantles the common argument among advocates of centralized planning that they can maintain political democracy by confining authoritarian direction to economic matters. The chapter begins by acknowledging the position of many planners, such as Stuart Chase, who assure the public that in a planned society, political democracy can remain if it confines itself to all but economic matters. This idea is appealing. If individuals only sacrifice freedom in the supposedly inferior realm of economic activities, they can pursue higher values more freely. Hayek argues that this assurance is altogether unwarranted because it rests on the erroneous belief that purely economic ends exist separately from other ends of life. Apart from the pathological case of the miser, the ultimate aims of rational human activities are never economic. What is commonly and misleadingly termed the economic motive is simply the desire for general opportunity or the power to achieve unspecified ends. Hayek highlights the essential role of money in preserving individual freedom. Money is described as one of the greatest instruments of freedom ever invented by man because it grants the widest possible choice in enjoying the fruits of one's efforts. In a competitive society, financial gains or losses usually affect only the fringe or the margin of an individual's needs. If a person suffers an economic loss, they retain the freedom to decide which of their less important desires they will sacrifice. Because individuals solve their own economic problems and decide what is most important to them, economic considerations appear secondary to other life values. However, this perceived insignificance of economic loss disappears entirely under planning. Economic control is not merely control of a sector of human life which can be separated from the rest. It is the control of the means for all our ends. Whoever controls all economic activity controls the limited means available for all individual ends and must therefore determine which ends are satisfied and which are neglected. The planner thus decides which values are to be rated higher or lower, in short, directing what men should believe and strive for. Because modern individuals rely on means provided by their fellow men for almost everything, economic planning would necessitate the direction of almost the whole of our life. Hayek states that virtually every aspect of life, from primary needs and family relations to the nature of one's work and the use of leisure, would fall under the planner's conscious control. The planning authority's power over consumption stems directly from its control over production. In a competitive market, an individual can turn to another seller if one refuses to satisfy their wishes. But an authority directing the entire economic system becomes the most powerful monopolist conceivable. While this authority might not seek maximum financial gain like a private monopolist, it would possess complete power to decide what we are to be given and on what terms. This control allows the authority to dictate available commodities, quantities, and their distribution among districts and groups. Crucially, it could discriminate between persons to any desired degree, ensuring that its own views of what people ought to like or dislike determine what they receive. Furthermore, Hayek notes that the control over foreign exchange is a decisive step toward totalitarianism because it suppresses all means of escape, preventing individuals from traveling or obtaining foreign books or journals without official approval. This control exerts a powerful influence over opinion. The freedom to choose one's employment is critical, as work consumes a large portion of life and determines one's social environment. Planners invariably promise to preserve this freedom, but Hayek argues they promise more than they can possibly fulfill. If planners intend to succeed, they must control either the entry into different trades or the terms of remuneration, or both. If a single planning authority universally exercises this control, the free choice of occupation becomes fictitious, as discrimination must be practiced. The central planning authority would be forced to simplify its immense task by reducing the diversity of human capacities and inclinations to a few categories of readily interchangeable units. Individuals who do not fit the standard mold, such as those preferring irregular hours, uncertain income, or those with unique but perhaps less obvious qualities. would lose the ability to make special arrangements with employers. Under this system, the individual would more than ever become mere means to be used by the authority in the service of such abstractions as the social welfare or the good of the community. The ability present in a competitive society to obtain things at a price, even a high one, is an undeniable safeguard of liberty. The alternative is the imposition of orders and prohibitions which must be obeyed. Hayek addresses the shifting rationale for planning. While initial claims rested on superior productivity, a claim progressively abandoned by serious students, the remaining core argument is that planning enables a more just and equitable distribution of wealth. It is undeniable that if society wishes to secure a distribution conforming to a predetermined standard, to decide consciously who is to have what, it must plan the entire economic system. However, the crucial question is whether the price paid for this realization of somebody's ideal of justice is not bound to be more discontent and more oppressive than the much-abused free play of economic forces ever caused. Hayek concludes by differentiating the scope of modern planning from historical economic regimentation. Even when economic life was highly regulated in the past, control was often limited, leaving the individual free in the sphere where they lived on their own products. Today, the vast progressive division of labor means that almost every activity is part of a social process. Therefore, substituting central planning for competition demands central direction of a much greater part of our lives than was ever attempted before. The economic freedom necessary for all other freedoms is not the freedom from economic care promised by socialists, which requires eliminating choice, but rather the freedom of our economic activity, which, with the right of choice, inevitably also carries the risk and the responsibility of that right. The argument of Chapter 7 can be likened to a marionette show. In a free society, the strings of economic constraint, the need to earn money and manage resources, are attached to our hands and feet, and we can choose our own dance, our ends. In a planned society, the centralized economic authority takes the strings, and though they promise to remove the financial worries, the bitter choice by controlling the means of action, they inevitably control the entire performance, making every movement subservient to the hidden purpose of the single puppeteer, the planner. Chapter 8, Whom, explores the inescapable consequences of centralized economic planning on social and political power, arguing that planning necessitates the arbitrary control of individuals by authorities, thereby destroying the fundamental freedoms offered by a competitive system. The title itself, drawn from a famous phrase used in early Soviet Russia, encapsulates the chapter's core problem. Who plans whom, who directs and dominates whom, who assigns to other people their station in life, and who is to have his due allotted by others. The chapter begins by addressing the common socialist objection that competition is blind. Hayek counters that this blindness is, in fact, a virtue akin to the blindness of the deity of justice. The competitive market is impartial. It is no respecter of persons. Rewards and penalties are determined by individuals' capacity, enterprise, luck, and unforeseeable circumstances, not by anyone's deliberate view of individual merits or demerits. The choice facing society is not between a system where everyone gets exactly what they deserve and one where outcomes are determined by chance. Rather, the choice is between a system where the will of a few persons decides who is to get what, and one where outcomes depend partly on the individual's ability and effort, and partly on impersonal, unpredictable circumstances. A key contention of the chapter is that private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for property owners, but also for those who do not possess it. When property is distributed among many independent owners, no single person holds complete power over others. Individuals are tied to a property owner only because that owner may offer better terms than anybody else. If all means of production are concentrated in a single hand, whether that of society or a dictator, the person or body exercising this control acquires complete power over every individual. A member of a small racial or religious minority, possessing no property themselves, is freer when other members of their community have property and can employ them than they would be if private property were abolished and control over the means of livelihood rested solely with the centralized coercive state. Hayek contends that the power of a wealthy neighbor or employer is very much less than that which the smallest functionary possesses who wields the coercive power of the state. A world where the wealthy are powerful is still a better world than one in which only the already powerful can acquire wealth. Even former prominent communist Max Eastman recognized that the evolution of private capitalism and its free market was a precondition for the development of democratic freedoms, a fact Marx himself had observed historically, but failed to project into the future consequences of abolishing private property. Many planners argue that while planning production is necessary, they can confine themselves to rational organization of industry and avoid determining individual incomes. Hayek states this is erroneous because in a centrally planned economy, it is impossible to direct industry without exercising definitive influence on distribution. The planner must balance the needs of various groups against each other, meaning they inevitably control the relative standing of different people. The conscious determination of individual positions by authority fundamentally changes how people relate to the social order and the state. Under competition, setbacks or disappointments are attributed to unpredictable circumstances. Under conscious direction, however, individuals recognize that their position is the result of the deliberate decision of authority. Discontent inevitably grows when suffering is the result of conscious human decision rather than impersonal forces. All individual efforts toward improvement must shift from foresight and adaptation to the market to influencing the authority which holds all the power. Once the state plans the entire economy, the problem of the due station of the different individuals and groups must indeed inevitably become the central political problem. Control over economic life makes the coercive power of the state the sole determinant of who gets what, making a share in this directing power the only power worth having. The planner must be guided by some principle of distributive justice, but Hayek argues that society lacks the necessary common moral standards to provide such guidance. While absolute equality would offer a definite, clear meaning to distributive justice, no socialist movement aiming for complete equality has ever gained substantial support. The actual goal is greater equality or more just distribution. This goal is merely negative, an expression of dislike for the current situation, and offers no concrete guidance on how to decide the innumerable questions of relative merits that arise when allocating resources. Because notions like just price or fair wage are determined by the production quantities, which the planner controls. The planner is forced to exercise direct, discretionary control over the conditions of the different people and groups. The decision to prioritize one industry or group's needs over another inherently involves discrimination. Quoting John Stuart Mill, Hayek underscores the impossibility of submission. A fixed rule, like that of equality, might be acquiesced in, and so might chance or an external necessity. But that a handful of human beings should weigh everybody in the balance and give more to one and less to another at their sole pleasure and judgment would not be born unless from persons believed to be more than men and backed by supernatural terrors. In simpler terms, imagine the teacher has a big plate of cookies and the rule is everyone gets one cookie. This is easy to agree with. Even if one person wishes they had 2 cookies, the rule is clear. It applies to everybody the same way. It's impartial and everyone knows exactly what to expect. People might be acquiesced in or quietly accept this because the standard is universal. The quote then says people can also accept things that happen due to chance or an external necessity. This is like if a strong wind suddenly blows some cookies off the plate, or if the baker only had flour to make small cookies this morning. A limitation of means or resources. You might be sad if you get a smaller cookie because of a mistake you made, or if the wind took your favorite one. But since this is nobody's conscious choice, and nobody meant to harm you, you blame bad luck, or the way the world works, not a specific person. Hayek explains that under the competitive system, the free market, the results often depend on unforeseeable circumstances. So disappointments are less degrading when they are the result of misfortune and not deliberately imposed by authority. The core problem Hayek and Mill identify lies in the third part of the quote, that a handful of human beings should weigh everybody in the balance and give more to one and less to another at their sole pleasure and judgment. Under central planning, the few people in charge. The planners cannot use simple, fixed rules because they must consciously direct the use of all resources to achieve a specific outcome, the common good. To do this, they must look at every person and decide their rank or what they deserve. This is like the teacher standing over the plate, looking at each child and deciding, this child, Bob, is very good at sharing, so he gets a big cake. This child, Alice, complained yesterday, so she gets only a crumb. When this small group makes decisions based on their sole pleasure and judgment, they are determining your individual position and status in life. When you suffer a loss, you know it is the deliberate decision of authority, not bad luck. This shift makes the inequality, which always exists, seem completely unjust and designed specifically to oppress you. Mill concludes that people simply would not be born. They would not tolerate this kind of arbitrary rule for people to accept being given more or less based entirely on the personal judgment of a few planners. Those planners would need to be believed to be more than men and backed by supernatural terrors. The conflict between different sets of ideals surfaces when a socialist policy is attempted with the support of different groups forming a majority. This process turns politics into a tug-of-war between the various pressure groups, where the crucial question is whose ideal will be imposed upon all by controlling the nation's entire resources. It is not guaranteed that the interests of the poorest and most numerous groups will prevail. The chapter effectively summarizes that economic planning demands the conscious balancing of conflicting interests by an authority. This means that individual success or failure is determined not by impersonal market forces or objective rules, but by the preferences, opinions, and coercive power of the state. The result is the reintroduction of a rule of status, where one's rank is assigned by authority, in contrast to the competitive system where one retains the freedom to pursue opportunities and face personal risks. The argument can be seen as illustrating that in a planned economy, life becomes a zero-sum political battle, like a court granting favors, whom, rather than a dispersed game of skill and chance guided by predictable, formal rules. Impersonal Justice. Chapter 9, Security and Freedom, analyzes the widespread demand for economic security, differentiating between two types of security, one of which is compatible with individual liberty and one which is not, ultimately arguing that the pursuit of absolute security through central planning leads inevitably to servitude. The chapter begins by noting that economic security is often presented, and with some justice, as an indispensable condition of real liberty. Hayek acknowledges that independence of mind or strength of character is rarely found among those who cannot be confident that they will make their way by their own effort. However, the idea of economic security is vague, and the general approval given to the demand for it can become a danger to liberty, especially when security is understood in too absolute a sense. Hayek contrasts two distinct kinds of security. 1. Limited security. Legitimate goal. Security against severe physical privation, guaranteeing a certain minimum of sustenance for all. This minimum should be sufficient to preserve health and the capacity to work. 2. Absolute security. Threat to freedom. The security of a given standard of life, or the security of the particular income a person is thought to deserve. This is also described as security against diminutions of income that occur in a competitive society even though they are in no way deserved. Hayek argues that the first kind of security, a guaranteed minimum, can be achieved in a wealthy society without endangering general freedom. This type of security can be provided for all outside of and supplementary to the market system. Furthermore, the state can legitimately enhance security in several ways consistent with individual freedom. Social insurance. The state should assist individuals in providing for common hazards of life, like sickness and accident, against which few individuals can make adequate provision, where the desire to avoid calamities is not weakened by assistance. That is, genuinely insurable risks. Comprehensive social insurance schemes are strongly supported, provided they do not tend to make competition ineffective. Mitigating disasters. Communal action should be taken to mitigate disasters, or acts of God, such as earthquakes and floods, against which the individual cannot guard himself or make provision. Combating fluctuations. The supremely important problem of combating general fluctuations of economic activity and large-scale unemployment requires much planning in the good sense. While some economists look to monetary policy, compatible with 19th century liberalism and others to large-scale public works, which must be watched carefully to avoid making economic activity dependent on government expenditure. These efforts do not lead to the kind of planning which constitutes such a threat to our freedom. The demand for the second, or absolute, kind of security is problematic because it represents another form of the demand for a just remuneration, a remuneration commensurate with subjective merits rather than objective results, which is ultimately irreconcilable with freedom to choose one's employment. In simplicity, imagine you are playing in a big room with lots of different activities, and the teacher is watching over everything. There are two main ways the teacher can keep you safe. 1. The minimum. The teacher says no matter what, everyone gets at least one good snack and a warm sweater. This is security against being hungry or cold. Everyone can have this safety without the teacher having to boss everyone around. 2. The absolute kind. This is when you demand, I should get to build block towers all day, and I must always get 3 shiny stickers, even if nobody needs a block tower today. This means you want your specific reward guaranteed, no matter what happens in the classroom. When you demand absolute security, you are really asking for a fair payment based on how hard you tried or how good you think you are. You worked really hard on your block tower. You think, I am a fantastic builder, so I deserve 3 stickers. But the teacher looks around and sees that everyone else needs someone to help clean up paint spills, not build more towers. The value of your tower, the objective result, is low right now, even if your effort was high. If the teacher had to give you 3 shiny stickers because you felt you deserved them, regardless of whether the classroom needed your block building skills, this would be forcing the world to pay you based on your feelings, not your usefulness. If you are guaranteed 3 stickers every day and you like building towers, you will never choose to stop building towers, even if the urgent work is cleaning paint, since the central authority, the teacher or planner, needs the paint cleaned. And the reward system, the stickers, is now fixed and cannot guide you to the right task. The teacher has only one way left to solve the problem: commands. The teacher must use a loud voice and a pointing finger to tell you, stop building. You must go clean the paint now. When the government guarantees your specific income based on perceived fairness or effort, it destroys the ability of the rewards to guide you to where you are needed. Therefore, if the planner wants the economy to work, they have to take away your choice and order you to the right job. The security of a specific income cannot be given to all if any freedom in the choice of one's occupation is to be allowed. The result is that you are perfectly safe and fairly paid by someone's judgment, but you are no longer free to choose what you do. This leads to a fundamental conflict between 2 irreconcilable types of social organization: the commercial, competitive, and the military type of society. The army represents the closest approach to an organization where work and worker alike are allotted by authority. This is the only system in which full economic security can be conceded to all its members, but it is inseparable from the restrictions on liberty and the hierarchical order of military life. The security of the barracks. The ultimate sanction of a competitive economy is the bailiff, bankruptcy, while the ultimate sanction of a planned economy is the hangman. In a planned system, a manager's mistake is not their own affair. It is a crime against the community and must be treated as such. The authority needs to maintain discipline, and without a free reservoir of labor, this cannot be maintained. Without corporal punishment, as with slave labor. Again, to put it simply, when a government tries to plan everyone's jobs and keep everyone safe, it creates a serious fight between 2 totally different ways of living. The competitive system, this is like free play where everyone gets to decide what game they want to play and what toy they want to use. The planned system, this is like being in an army or living in a barracks. In this system, the boss decides everything. Your job and your exact place are allotted by authority. The only good thing about the military way is that the boss can give full economic security to everyone, but this safety comes at a huge price. You lose your liberty. You cannot choose your own game, you cannot run around, and you must always stay in the marching line exactly where the leader tells you to stand. This is the hierarchical order of military life. In the free play competitive system, if you build a terrible tower that falls down, you lose your blocks and you might lose the game. The final punishment is the bailiff. That means you just run out of money or resources. You fail on your own, and you have to start over. In the military plan system, if you make a mistake, it's not just your problem. Since your job was part of the one single plan for the whole community, your mistake is treated like a huge crime against the community, because you ruined the plan for everybody. The final punishment for this huge crime is death or imprisonment. In a free system, if you hate your job, you can quit and find another job somewhere else. This is called a free reservoir of labor. But in a planned system, the boss needs everyone to stay in their assigned place to make the single plan work. If people are guaranteed their income, they won't move jobs, even if they are needed elsewhere. So if the boss cannot rely on you wanting a different reward to make you move, and you are not free to leave if you don't like the rules, the only way the boss can keep order and make you obey their direct orders is by using corporal punishment. The continuous attempt to grant piecemeal security to particular groups, like certain trades or industries, is typically done through restrictionism such as price stabilization or control of output. With every grant of complete security to one group, the insecurity of the rest necessarily increases. If some are guaranteed a fixed share of a variable economic cake, the remaining share left to others fluctuates proportionally more. Every restriction on the freedom of entry into a trade reduces the security of those outside it. This leads to the utter hopelessness of the position of those who are left outside the range of sheltered occupation. The protection of the standard of life of some groups, often though well established, prevents the necessary adjustments, resulting in unemployment and insecurity for large sections of the population. Hayek calls the exploitation of weaker members of a group by the well-established through regulation of competition the worst and most cruel exploitation of one class by another. As security becomes a privilege, social values change. Independence is replaced by security as the determinant of rank and status. The spirit of commercial enterprise is disparaged, and the making of profit is regarded as immoral, leading young people to prefer the safe, salaried position to the risk of enterprise. Hayek warns that the virtues traditionally valued by Anglo-Saxon nations, independence, self-reliance, and willingness to bear risks, are precisely the ones being destroyed by the progress of collectivism. The conclusion is that security must be provided outside the market to avoid destroying individual freedom. If individuals are to be free, they must be willing to accept that freedom can be had only at a price, and must be prepared to make severe material sacrifices to preserve their liberty. The search for absolute economic security in a planned system is like insisting that everyone in a fleet of ships must be guaranteed a perfectly level, calm deck, regardless of the winds and waves of the ocean. Economic change. The only way to guarantee this perfect stability for everyone is to tie all the ships tightly together and place them under the command of a single master. While the wealthy are protected, those outside the privileged groups find the resulting rigid formation makes navigating the open sea impossible, sacrificing the fleet's mobility and their personal command over their destiny for the illusion of collective, ordered safety. Chapter 10, Why the Worst Get on Top, addresses a common misconception that the horrors of totalitarian regimes are merely accidents of history or the result of specific bad leaders. Hayek argues that the repellent features of totalitarianism are not accidental byproducts, but are the necessary and inevitable consequences of a centralized, planned system. The core thesis is that the inherent requirements of enforcing a single comprehensive plan on society systematically favor and select for the most unscrupulous, unprincipled, and ruthless individuals to occupy the positions of supreme power. The transition to a totalitarian regime is often driven by a widespread demand for quick and determined government action, fueled by dissatisfaction with the cumbersome nature of democratic procedure. People seek a strong, resolute leader or party capable of getting things done, which means finding someone with solid support who can carry out whatever they want. Hayek states that the democratic statesman who attempts to plan economic life comprehensively will soon face the choice of either assuming dictatorial powers or abandoning their plans. The old socialist parties were inhibited by their democratic ideals and did not possess the ruthlessness required for the performance of their chosen task. They clung to the hope that the majority could agree on a single plan for society. Totalitarianism, conversely, requires leaders who are ready to disregard ordinary morals and execute the plan. The ability to enforce a single unified direction for all affairs means that power is likely to be concentrated in the largest single group whose members agree sufficiently to make unified direction possible. Hayek identifies three main reasons why the group that successfully enforces a comprehensive plan will likely be composed of the worst, rather than the best, elements of society. A. Lower moral and intellectual standards unite the largest group. The more complex and intelligent individuals become, the more their views and tastes are differentiated, making them less likely to agree on a single comprehensive hierarchy of values. Conversely, if a high degree of uniformity and similarity of outlook is needed to impose a plan on society, the required numbers are found among the lowest common denominator, people whose instincts and tastes are more primitive and common. This does not imply that the majority of people have low morals, but that the largest group united by similar values will be those with lower standards. B. The attraction of the docile and gullible. A potential dictator must expand the ranks of this core group by converting others to the simple creed. The people who are most easily won over are the docile and gullible, who have no strong convictions of their own but are willing to accept a ready-made system of values if it is relentlessly and loudly advertised. The passions and emotions of these easily swayed people readily swell the ranks of the totalitarian party. C. The power of negative programs, the enemy. The third and most important negative selection element is the use of a negative program. It is easier for large masses of people to agree on hatred or the envy of those better off than on any positive, constructive task. The common fight against those outside the group, the contrast between the we and the they, is an essential element in knitting a group together for action, leaving the leader greater freedom of action than a detailed positive program would allow. The enemy, whether internal like the Jew or the kulak or external plutocracies, becomes an indispensable requisite for the totalitarian leader. In Germany, the selection of the Jew as the enemy stemmed from the anti-capitalist resentment that was the foundation of the Nazi movement. Because Jews were often excluded from highly esteemed occupations, they were left to pursue commercial trades, leading them to be seen as representatives of the capitalist system, a fact rarely grasped by foreign observers. Once the concentration of power is complete, the totalitarian system requires specific moral attributes that are antithetical to liberal values. While individualist philosophers like Lord Acton viewed power itself as the arch-evil, the strict collectivist views power as a goal in itself. Collectivism must create power over men wielded by other men, of a magnitude never before known. The basic collectivist premise is that the individual is merely a means to serve the ends of the higher entity, society or the nation. From this premise, intolerance and the brutal suppression of dissent are seen as essential and unavoidable. In a system dominated by a single purpose, cruelty may become a duty, and acts that revolt ordinary feelings like the shooting of hostages or killing the sick are treated as matters of expediency. To run such a state, the leader's instruments must be completely unprincipled and unreservedly committed to the leader's will. They must be ready actively to break every moral rule he has ever known, if necessary to achieve the supreme end. There will be specific jobs, such as those involving cruelty, intimidation, deliberate deception, and spying. For example, the Gestapo, concentration camp administration, or propaganda ministries that are necessary for the functioning of the state, since all those influenced by traditional morals will be reluctant to perform these vile deeds. The readiness to do bad things becomes a path to promotion and power. Hayek quotes a distinguished American economist who compared the probability of good men gaining power in a collectivist state to the probability that a tender-hearted person would get the job of whipping master in a slave plantation. In conclusion, the title, "Why the Worst Get on Top," is justified by the logic of centralized planning. The system requires a singular agreed-upon purpose, but such purpose can only be enforced by a highly cohesive group willing to abandon traditional morality. This combination naturally excludes the highly moral and intelligent who disagree on ends, and selects those who are easiest to manipulate, who rally around hatred, and who are ruthless enough to execute the plan through coercion. Hayek emphasizes that the transition to totalitarianism means that socialism can be put into practice only by methods of which most socialists disapprove. Chapter 11, The End of Truth, examines how the necessary functioning of a totalitarian, centrally planned state inherently requires the destruction of intellectual freedom and the concept of objective truth. The chapter begins with the assertion that the nationalization of thought has proceeded everywhere pari passu with the nationalization of industry. To make the single system of ends defined by the social plan function efficiently, the totalitarian system must ensure that everyone not only is forced to work toward those ends but also comes to believe in those ends. It is essential that the beliefs, though chosen for the people and imposed upon them, become their own, leading individuals to act spontaneously as the planner desires. If the feeling of oppression is less acute in totalitarian countries than foreigners imagine, it is because the governments largely succeed in molding people's thoughts. This molding is accomplished through propaganda. While propaganda and its techniques are not unique to totalitarianism, its nature and effect are fundamentally changed, because all instruments of propaganda are coordinated to influence individuals in the same direction. This produces the characteristic Gleichschaltung, coordination of all minds. When all sources of current information are under single control, the skilled propagandist can mold minds in any direction, and even intelligent individuals cannot escape this influence if long isolated from other sources. The moral consequences of this systematic propaganda are profoundly destructive, because they undermine one of the foundations of all morals, the sense of and the respect for truth. Propaganda cannot confine itself merely to values. It must extend to questions of fact. This extension is necessary for two reasons. 1. To justify the official values, propagandists must make assertions about the causal connections between means and ends to persuade people that the new values align with those they already hold. 2. The distinction between ends and means is rarely clear-cut in practice, so the population must be brought to agree not only with the ultimate goals but also with the views about the facts and possibilities underpinning the specific measures chosen by the planners. Since the complete ethical code required for the economic plan does not exist in advance but must be created through particular decisions, the planner must rationalize these decisions publicly to secure active community support. This necessity forces the planner to construct assertions about connections between facts, a myth or pseudoscientific theory, that then become an indispensable part of the governing doctrine. Examples of such myths include Plato's noble lies or Sorel's myths, or the Nazi concept of Blut und Boden, blood and soil, which expresses not just ultimate values but a host of beliefs about cause and effect that cannot be questioned once they direct community activity. One of the most characteristic traits of the intellectual climate in totalitarian regimes is the complete perversion of language, the technique of using old words but changing their meaning to make them serve the new ideology. The word liberty is a major casualty, often being destroyed in the name of some new freedom. This collective freedom, as advocated by some planners like Dr. Karl Mannheim, is defined not as the freedom of society's members but as the unlimited freedom of the planner to direct society. This represents the confusion of freedom with power taken to the extreme. Other fundamental terms like justice, law, right, and equality similarly have their meanings reversed. This continuous process of linguistic change eventually renders the whole language despoiled, making rational discussion impossible as words become empty shells used only for their emotional associations. To maintain unity, criticism must be suppressed. Since the official creed includes all views about facts necessary for the plan and every governmental act must become sacrosanct and exempt from doubt. Any public expression of doubt or fear is treated as an act of disloyalty or sabotage, according to the Webb's report on Russian enterprises. Since loyalty is paramount, the entire apparatus for spreading knowledge, schools, press, radio, and motion picture, is used exclusively to propagate views that support the authority, while all information that might cause hesitation is withheld. The probable effect on the people's loyalty becomes the only criterion for deciding what information is published or suppressed. This systematic control applies even to subjects seemingly remote from politics, especially the sciences. In human affairs disciplines, history, law, or economics, the disinterested search for truth is abandoned, and vindication of official views becomes the sole objective. Authorities decide which doctrines are taught and published. Totalitarian regimes show an intense dislike of the more abstract forms of thought. This leads to the condemnation of theories like relativity as a Semitic attack on the foundation of Christian and Nordic physics, or the rejection of mathematical statistics, because it provides no guarantee that it will serve the interest of the people. Furthermore, totalitarianism condemns any human activity done for its own sake, like science for science's sake or art for art's sake. Every activity must derive its justification from a conscious social purpose, because spontaneous, unguided activity might produce unforeseen results. This principle extends even to games, where it was urged that we must finish once and for all with the neutrality of chess. Once science must serve the interests of a class, community, or state, the word truth ceases to have its old meaning. Truth becomes something laid down by authority that must be believed to ensure unified, organized effort, and it may be altered as the exigencies of that effort require. Contempt for intellectual liberty is widespread among intellectuals who have embraced the collectivist faith. Some justify suppressing dissent by arguing that since the masses' opinions are always shaped by outside factors like propaganda anyway, the power should be used deliberately to direct thoughts toward a desirable direction. However, the value of intellectual freedom is not that everyone achieves independent thought, but that any cause or idea may be argued by somebody, so long as dissent is not suppressed. The growth of reason is a social process that depends on the interaction of individuals with different views, and its results cannot be predicted or planned without simultaneously limiting it. The ultimate tragedy of collectivist thought is that while it begins by seeking to make reason supreme, it ends by destroying reason because it misunderstands the super-individual process upon which the growth of reason depends. In contrast, individualism is an attitude of humility before this social process and tolerance toward other opinions, representing the opposite of the intellectual hubris found in the demand for comprehensive social direction. Chapter 12, The Socialist Roots of Nazism, argues that National Socialism was not a reactionary capitalist movement, but rather the logical, illiberal culmination of pre-existing socialist and collectivist intellectual trends in Germany, culminating in a fusion of radical and conservative anti-capitalist forces. Hayek begins by dismissing the common mistake that National Socialism was merely an irrational revolt against reason. Instead, its doctrines represent the culmination of a long evolution of thought and a system developed with ruthless consistency. Hayek defines it as simply collectivism freed from all traces of an individualist tradition which might hamper its realization. Although German thinkers took the lead in this development, they were not alone. Hayek notes that non-Germans like Thomas Carlyle, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Auguste Comte, and Georges Sorel are also part of this continuous intellectual history. Hayek states that before 1914, these ideas were marginal, held by a small minority. The success came because the movement garnered support not from the bourgeoisie or capitalist reaction, but precisely from the socialist camp. The ruling elements in Germany opposed not the socialist aspect of Marxism, but its liberal components, internationalism and democracy. As it became clear that these liberal elements hindered the realization of socialism, the socialists of the left and the right approached each other, forming a union of the anti-capitalist forces that drove liberalism entirely out of Germany. Hayek identifies the connection between socialism and nationalism in Germany as close from the beginning, noting that important ancestors of National Socialism, Fichte, Rodbertus, and Lassalle, are simultaneously recognized as fathers of socialism. From the outbreak of World War I onwards, teachers arose from the ranks of Marxist socialism to lead laborers and idealistic youth into the National Socialist movement, leading to a rapid growth in the Hitlerian doctrine. Werner Sombart, an initial Marxian socialist as late as 1909. Sombart's book, Händler und Helden, Merchants and Heroes, published in 1915, welcomed the war as the inevitable conflict between the commercial civilization of England and the heroic culture of Germany. Sombart expressed unlimited contempt for the individualistic goal of happiness. He championed the German idea of the state derived from Fichte, Lassalle, and Rodbertus, where the state is a Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, in which the individual holds no rights but only duties. He viewed the English ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, the ideas of 1789 as inherently commercial ideals focused on individual advantages. Sombart glorified war as the consummation of the heroic view of life, seeing the war against England as a struggle against the commercial ideal of individual freedom and comfort, symbolized contemptuously by English safety razors. Johann Plensch, another authority on Marx, Plensch wrote 1789 and 1914, the symbolic years in the history of the political mind, which focused on the conflict between the ideal of freedom 1789 and the ideal of organization 1914. Plensch argued that organization is the essence of socialism, which Marx betrayed with his adherence to the abstract idea of freedom. He saw the economic world war as the third great epoch of spiritual struggle, after the Reformation and the bourgeois revolution of liberty, fighting for the victory of socialism and organization. The German war economy of 1914 represented the first realization of a socialist society, establishing the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft of National Socialism. He later insisted that socialism must be power policy, arguing that consistent socialism cannot grant absolute rights of self-determination, which he equated with individualistic economic anarchy. Chemist Wilhelm Ostwald publicly proclaimed that Germany had discovered the significance of organization and aimed to organize Europe, which lacked it, contrasting this with individualism. Walter Rathenau, the raw material dictator during the war, greatly influenced the economic views of the post-war German generation, even though he would have regretted the ultimate consequences of his totalitarian economics. Friedrich Naumann's book Mitteleuropa spread the same combination of socialism and imperialism. Paul Lensch, a leading socialist politician of the left wing, Lensch described the war as the flight of the English bourgeoisie before the advance of socialism. Lensch argued that Bismarck's adoption of protectionism made Germany the revolutionary state, possessing a higher and more advanced economic system. He contended that the prerequisites for socialism were already established in Germany, simplifying the struggle for socialism there, and asserted that socialism is coming, and in fact has to some extent already arrived since we can no longer live without it. He criticized German liberals for adhering to old-fashioned and shattered English individualistic concepts of freedom and civic right. Lensch insightfully observed that the German state underwent a process of socialization and conversely, social democracy underwent a process of nationalization due to the party's deep penetration of state organs. The ideas of Plensch and Lensch directly influenced the immediate masters of National Socialism, notably Oswald Spengler and Arthur Moller van den Broek. Oswald Spengler, in Prussianism and Socialism 1920, Spengler argued that the old Prussian spirit and socialist conviction are one and the same, viewing German liberals as the invisible English army left behind by Napoleon. Spengler contrasted the three national forms of existence: freedom, liberal parliamentarism, equality, social democracy, and community authoritarian socialism. The Prussian instinct holds that the power belongs to the whole, demanding command or obedience. To Spengler, liberalism is contemptible on German soil. He envisioned the future state as a Beamtenstaat, state of officials, where the administration of all property becomes a salaried function, concluding, Prussianism and socialism combat the England in our midst. Arthur Moller van den Broek, the patron saint of National Socialism, proclaimed that World War I was a war between liberalism and socialism, asserting, "We have lost the war against the West. Socialism has lost it against liberalism." Moller van den Broek gloried in the fact that there were no liberals left in Germany. They were recognized as the archenemy. His Third Reich was intended to provide a German socialism undefiled by Western liberal ideas. Hayek concludes by noting that this fight against liberalism united socialists and conservatives, feeding groups like the German youth movement. Conservative socialism became the slogan that prepared the atmosphere for National Socialism, revealing a trend that Hayek identifies as dangerously prevalent in contemporary English and American thought: the drawing together of socialists of the left and the right, united by a common contempt for liberalism. This historical development illustrates Hayek's central concern. The intellectual history of the last 60 or 80 years is indeed a perfect illustration of the truth that in social evolution nothing is inevitable, but thinking makes it so. Chapter 13, The Totalitarians in Our Midst, serves as a stark warning to Western nations, arguing that the intellectual and policy trends prevalent in countries like England and the United States mirror the developments that paved the way for totalitarianism in Germany. Hayek begins by challenging the prevalent assumption that the outrages committed by totalitarian governments are so immense that such a system cannot happen here, in more enlightened countries. He reminds the reader that the possibility of Nazism rising in Germany would have seemed equally fantastic to Germans and foreign observers only 15 years before. Hayek asserts that the doctrines which led to totalitarianism in Germany and even specific totalitarian principles themselves are finding an increasing fascination in other countries, including England. He finds an alarming impression when perusing English works on future economic policy, because almost every word could be applied to the views most conspicuous in current English literature that dominated Germany during and after the First World War. Hayek recalls Lord Keynes's summary of a German work published in 1915 advocating the militarization of our industrial life. This doctrine prioritized the strengthening of the organized unity of the state for maximum efficiency, Leistungsfähigkeit, rather than the greater happiness of the individual. This German view sought to abolish capitalism based on profit and end the commercial ideals derived from England. Hayek notes that nearly every sentiment of this hideous doctrine is reflected in contemporary English literature, with the sole distinction being that no English author has yet dared openly to disparage individual happiness. Hayek argues that almost every single feature of Hitler's system has been recommended for use in England or America by someone, including individuals who are Hitler's mortal enemies due to specific policies like anti-Semitism, but are otherwise confirmed totalitarians of the German type in every other respect. Hayek singles out certain sincere idealists, particularly intellectuals and specialists, as the leading figures preparing the way for this totalitarian course. Professor E.H. Carr is cited as a prominent example, frankly confessing adherence to the German historical school of realists traced through Hegel and Marx. Carr's realism proposes that morality is a function of politics and accepts no value standard beyond that of fact. This contrasts with the utopian individualism of the 18th century, which made the human conscience the final court of appeal. Carr minimizes the distinction between a Nazi saying anything that benefits the German people is right and the democratic identification of national interest with universal right. Carr also advocates the disappearance of the 19th century distinction between society and state, a concept Hayek explicitly links to Nazi theoretician Carl Schmitt. Carr supports the regimentation of opinion by arguing that the mass production of opinion is the corollary of the mass production of goods, echoing Nazi justifications for controlling the press. Carr views the struggle as a revolution against liberal democracy and laissez-faire economics, asserting that the future belongs to the German model of Großraumwirtschaft, extensive area economy, and declares that the result which we desire can be won only by a deliberate reorganization of European life such as Hitler has undertaken. Carr even dedicates a section to the moral functions of war, praising war as the most powerful instrument of social solidarity. Hayek then addresses the specific danger posed by the scientists and technical experts who clamor for the scientific organization of society, a trend long established in Germany. He references Julien Bender's Trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the intellectuals, which warned that intellectuals were creating a superstition of science, competent even in the domain of morality, thereby justifying arbitrary authority and eliminating both human liberty and the historical action of the individual. As a contemporary example, Hayek discusses C.H. Waddington's The Scientific Attitude, which advocates for greater political power for scientists and wholesale planning. Waddington believes that science can pass ethical judgment on human behavior. He dismisses freedom as a very troublesome concept for the scientist and explicitly states that the freedom to be odd and unlike one's neighbor is not a scientific value. Waddington's beliefs are founded on inevitable historical tendencies derived from Marxism, which he claims is nearly identical to the scientific approach to nature, justifying an economy that will be centralized and totalitarian. The intellectual trends are reinforced by material interests. Hayek identifies the greatest menace of all as the convergence of policies favored by organized capital and organized labor toward the monopolistic organization of industry. Capitalist organizers favor a cooperative society of self-governing estates. However, these promoters of monopoly are short-sighted. Believing they can retain control, they will soon find themselves subordinates, just as their German counterparts did. The state, unable to allow private control over such massive power, must regulate these monopolies, leading to the machinery of monopoly becoming identical with the machinery of the state. Hayek calls the labor movement's support for policies leading to monopoly one of the saddest spectacles of our time. This destructive policy benefits a minority of workers, those in the privileged organized groups who share in the monopoly profits, largely at the expense of the community, and the poorest members, those in less organized industries and the unemployed. Hayek warns that when labor leaders proclaim they are done once and for all with the mad competitive system, they are proclaiming the doom of the freedom of the individual. There is no middle ground. The only options are the impersonal discipline of the market or direction by the will of a few individuals. Hayek concludes by describing the program of the British Labour Party committed to a planned society as a most depressing experience, noting it is practically indistinguishable from the failed socialist dreams which dominated German discussion 25 years ago. He fears that the Labour Party has essentially aligned itself with a reactionary movement, making the opposition to collectivism the monopoly of a second reactionary party, thereby leaving little hope for the future. Chapter 14, Material Conditions and Ideal Ends, addresses the pervasive modern sentiment that society should disregard economic constraints in the pursuit of higher, idealistic goals, arguing that this attitude is fundamentally misguided and poses a significant danger to civilization itself. The chapter begins by observing that the current generation often flatters itself that it attaches less importance to economic considerations than previous generations. However, Hayek suggests that the notion of the end of economic man is one of the governing myths of the age. Hayek argues this claim is largely untrue because the major demands for social reconstruction being pressed are almost entirely economic in character. He points to the demands for the reinterpretation in economic terms of political ideals like liberty, equality, and security as evidence of this. Furthermore, modern men are perhaps more than ever governed by economic doctrines such as the belief in the irrationality of the economic system, false claims about potential plenty, pseudo-theories regarding the inevitable trend toward monopoly, and misplaced blame on competition for issues like the destruction of raw materials, which Hayek asserts could not happen under competition but are enabled by monopoly, often government-aided. Instead of demonstrating a contempt for material welfare, the modern attitude is characterized by a refusal to recognize any obstacles or conflicts with other aims that might impede the immediate fulfillment of desires. Hayek suggests economophobia is a more fitting term for this attitude. The modern individual is characterized by a revolt against the impersonal forces to which humanity previously submitted, even though these forces often frustrated individual efforts. This stems from a general unwillingness to submit to any rule or necessity whose rationale is not fully understood, a mindset that is often commendable but destructive when applied universally. Hayek argues that because modern civilization is so complex, it is impossible for anyone to fully understand the forces determining things like price changes, income levels, or occupational shifts. In a complex society, individuals must adjust to changes whose cause and nature they cannot comprehend. He insists that civilization's growth was made possible by man's submission to the impersonal forces of the market. This submission, whether derived from religious humility or respect for early economic doctrines, allowed individuals to unwittingly help build something greater than any single mind could comprehend. The attempt to escape the impersonal, seemingly irrational market forces leads to the demand for submission to the equally uncontrollable and arbitrary power of other men. Hayek warns that this incomplete and erroneous rationalism is the path to the destruction of civilization and blocks future progress. While planning proponents argue that society must master social forces like it mastered nature, Hayek asserts that this comparison is mistaken, as it fails to recognize how the preservation of civilization depends on the coordination of individual efforts by impersonal forces. Hayek reiterates the crucial point that individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose to which society is permanently subordinated. The only exception is during temporary disasters like war, when freedom may be sacrificed temporarily to secure it in the long run. However, systems proposed as permanent arrangements, such as planning for peace using methods learned in war, are misleading and dangerous. This rule applies even to the seemingly paramount goal of conquering unemployment, often articulated as full employment. Hayek warns against the irresponsible idealist who insists this must be accomplished at any price, as the single-minded focus is likely to cause the greatest harm. Hayek illustrates this problem with the post-war scenario. Many workers specialized in high-paying war jobs would need to transfer to new, less remunerative positions. If maximum employment is sought exclusively through monetary expansion, it leads to progressive inflationary expansion and holds up necessary labor redistributions. A policy constantly aiming for the maximum employment achievable by monetary means is ultimately certain to defeat its own purposes, lowering the productivity of labor and constantly increasing the proportion of the workforce requiring artificial support to maintain present wages. The main condition for resumed economic progress is that people be ready to adapt quickly to the changed world, and that the accustomed standards of particular groups must not obstruct this adaptation. He urges that resources be directed to where they contribute most to general wealth. Hayek insists that a uniform minimum must be secured for everybody, but simultaneously, all claims for privileged security for particular classes must lapse. Hayek states that proclaiming, "Damn economics, let us build up a decent world," is merely irresponsible. The only chance for building a decent world is to continue improving the general level of wealth, as modern democracy will crack under a prolonged lowering or stationariness of living standards. The rise of totalitarianism on the continent was crucially facilitated by the existence of a large, dispossessed middle class, a factor absent in England and America at the time. Hayek argues that the 50-year trend toward collectivism has not raised moral standards but has been in the opposite direction. The essential point Hayek stresses is that morals are necessarily a phenomenon of individual conduct and can only exist where the individual is free to decide for himself and voluntarily sacrifice personal advantage to a moral rule. Outside the sphere of individual responsibility there is neither goodness nor badness, neither opportunity for moral merit nor the chance of proving one's conviction by sacrificing one's desires to what one thinks right. The essential elements of morals are responsibility not to a superior but to one's conscience, awareness of a duty not exacted by compulsion, the necessity to decide which values must be sacrificed, and bearing the consequences of that decision. The core promise of the collectivist movement is the relief from responsibility, which renders its effect anti-moral, regardless of its lofty ideals. Hayek observes that the individual obligation to remedy inequities has been weakened, and people are more tolerant of abuses and indifferent to individual injustices because they anticipate a future state-run system will correct everything. The virtues resting on an individualist society, independence, self-reliance, willingness to bear risks, backing one's conviction against the majority, and voluntary cooperation are precisely what collectivism is destroying. Collectivism replaces these with only the demand for obedience and compulsion. Hayek concludes by asking which values are giving way in modern society. It is not material comfort or standard of living. Instead, the values increasingly regarded as 19th century illusions are all moral values: liberty and independence, truth and intellectual honesty, peace and democracy, and respect for the individual qua man. He notes that the new fixed poles are the protected standards of this or that group, giving them the right to exclude others, accepting discrimination, and disregarding individual rights when government acts in the interest of a favored group. This progressive blunting of the moral sense, coupled with a belief that the democracies are rapidly reforming by moving toward totalitarian ideas, is a fatal blunder that undermines the true moral basis of Western civilization. The way to win the war of ideologies is by regaining faith in the traditional liberal values of free and upright, tolerant and independent people. Chapter 15, The Prospects of International Order, addresses the problems associated with establishing lasting peace and international cooperation in a world dominated by collectivist, nationalistic economic planning, ultimately proposing a return to the principles of a limited international rule of law through federation. Hayek begins by asserting that the world has paid dearly in the field of international relations for abandoning 19th century liberalism, which is where the retreat began. The central lesson that must be learned is that economic planning executed independently on a national scale is inherently harmful and creates serious international friction. Planning at the national level often requires the planning authority to shut out external influences, inevitably resulting in the piling up of restrictions on the movements of goods and people. Even more dangerous are the issues arising from the artificially fostered economic solidarity within countries and the new blocks of opposed interests created by planning nationally. If nations treat their resources as exclusive national properties and international economic relations become relations between entire nations organized as trading bodies, rather than between individuals, this inevitably creates friction and envy. The illusion that substituting negotiations between organized groups for competition would reduce friction is fatal. It merely replaces the struggle of competition with a contest of force transferred to powerful, armed states subject to no superior law. Hayek warns that if victory in the war merely leads to the rise of many national socialisms, all equally totalitarian and nationalistic, the world will be in recurrent conflict. He suggests Germany appears as the initial disturber of peace only because it was the first country to take this collectivist path. Those who recognize the dangers of national planning often conclude that economic planning must be undertaken internationally, meaning by a supranational authority. Hayek argues that this approach poses even greater difficulties and dangers. The conflict between planning and freedom escalates as the similarity of standards and values among those subjected to a unitary plan diminishes. While planning is easier in a small community with agreed-upon standards, as the area and diversity increase, the necessity to rely on force and compulsion grows. Hayek illustrates this lack of common moral basis by asking who can imagine common ideals of distributive justice strong enough to make a Norwegian fisherman sacrifice his economic improvement to help his Portuguese counterpart, or a Dutch worker pay more for his bicycle to assist an English mechanic. Those advocating such schemes mistakenly assume that they will be the ones settling these complex moral questions justly. Attempting to plan the economy of a vast area containing diverse peoples through democratic means shows a complete lack of awareness of the problems. International planning can only be a naked rule of force, imposing the standards of a small group or even a dominant power like a Herrenvolk master race on all the rest. The imposition of centralized economic direction on people with widely divergent values necessitates the use of force, which can compel even idealists to act in ways that appear highly immoral to those affected. Hayek highlights that even well-meaning people in England were suggesting victory should be used to ensure British industry can utilize its wartime equipment and secure employment for its citizens, a position Hayek views as showing a complete unawareness of the moral enormity involved in using force for such purposes. The idea that international planning would work because the common interests of the working classes would override national differences is a fatal delusion. In a planned international system, the economic interests of workers in different countries would clash just as fiercely as those of different classes within a country. For example, a worker in a poor country will view minimum wage legislation championed by a colleague in a wealthy country as a means to deprive him of his only chance to improve his conditions. If the international authority is tasked with bringing about distributive justice between peoples, class strife would inevitably become a struggle between the working classes of different nations. To put it simply, this is Hayek's way of warning that trying to manage the entire global economy actually makes different groups of people fight each other even harder than before. Imagine that, instead of letting different kids trade their snacks and toys freely, a giant world playground boss decided to run the whole economic system for all the countries. This boss wants to be sure everyone gets a fair share of everything. This is the goal of distributive justice. Imagine a worker from a rich country who makes expensive toys and already gets paid a high wage. Says, the boss must pass a big rule. Everyone in the world who makes toys must be paid a very high minimum amount of money, no matter what. The worker from a poor country, who is happy to work for less money because any job is better than none, sees that rule as a problem. He knows his country can only compete because he is willing to work for slightly less than the rich country worker. The poor worker sees the rich worker's rule, which is supposed to help everyone, as something that actually deprives him of his only chance to improve his conditions. The minimum wage rule stops him from getting a job that helps him move up, because now the factories won't hire him since they must pay the high wage set by the rule. Because the world playground boss has taken on the huge job of deciding what is fair between different groups of people who have widely different ideas and values, this leads to intense conflict. Think of it like a global sports league where one team is much richer and more powerful than the others. If the rich team makes all the rules for what everyone gets paid, the poor teams won't see that as fair. They'll feel those rules are designed to keep them from ever catching up, turning the competition into a fight between the powerful countries and everyone else over who controls the league's wealth. This system of international planning, because it lacks a common moral basis across all peoples, can only be executed as a naked rule of force imposed by the strongest group. Regarding proposals to plan for the equalization of standards of life in regions like the Danube Basin, Hayek contends this would require fixing an order of priorities among various claims. For example, whether the Romanian peasants' needs are more urgent than the Albanians. Once the plan is enforced, everyone will feel that the plan, dictated by the dominant power, has unjustly relegated their interests. Forcing this plan upon small nations, each believing in its own superiority, is a task that can only be performed by force. The belief that international planning can be achieved by conferring merely specific economic powers on separate technical bodies rests on the fallacy that economic planning is objective. An international economic authority, not subject to a superior political power, would be able to exercise the most tyrannical and irresponsible power imaginable, even if strictly confined to one field, such as air transport. For example, a controller of essential raw materials like gasoline or timber would be the master of the fate of whole industries and countries, deciding whether new industries are permitted or precluded. Such powers could be justified by technical necessities or humanitarian arguments, making effective control of that power difficult. Hayek views such proposals for autonomous, international monopolies as potentially the worst of all conceivable rackets. Hayek dismisses the ambition to create a powerful world organization charged with numerous tasks, stating that this attempt spoiled the League of Nations' chances of preserving peace. Instead, he argues for an international system based on federation. A federation is the application of democracy to international affairs, but with definitely limited powers. It is the only way to establish international law as a reality, as law requires a power to enforce it, and federalism prevents this power from becoming unlimited. The necessary powers of an international authority must be strictly circumscribed by the rule of law. These powers should be mainly negative, restraining nations from action harmful to their neighbors, particularly restrictive economic measures. The international authority should have the minimum powers necessary to preserve peaceful relationships, essentially the powers of the ultra-liberal laissez-faire state. This approach would make harmful planning difficult while leaving desirable planning free for local authorities. Hayek strongly criticizes the notion that unrestricted political sovereignty can coexist with the creation of an international economic authority. He believes the opposite is needed, a superior political power, federation, to hold conflicting economic interests in check. Hayek concludes by recalling that the federal ideal was the hope of most 19th century liberal thinkers as the next great step in civilization's advance. By limiting and dividing sovereign power, federation is the only method of curbing not only the majority but the power of the whole people, thus acting as one of the best safeguards of peace and preserving democracy and local self-government. The great opportunity of the post-war settlement is for the victorious powers to submit to a system of rules that they enforce equally upon themselves and others. Chapter 16, Conclusion, serves as F. A. Hayek's final reflection on the entire argument of the road to serfdom, summarizing the book's intent, the necessary future direction for society, and the enduring principle upon which freedom rests. Hayek begins by clarifying that the purpose of the book was fundamentally critical and was not intended to sketch a detailed program of a desirable future order of society. He notes that he ventured a little beyond its essentially critical task only with regard to international affairs, because setting up a framework in that field soon will be crucial, as future growth may have to proceed within it for a long time to come. He immediately suggests that providing a detailed blueprint for a desirable internal social order would likely be useless at this stage, or beyond anyone's competence to furnish. Instead, the urgent need is for people to come to agree on certain principles and to free themselves from past errors that have governed recent thought. Hayek contends that true progress requires recognizing past mistakes and having the courage to abandon failed policies. He emphasizes that society must acknowledge that much that we have done was very foolish if it is ever to grow wiser. To build a better world, society must have the courage to make a new start, even if this means some reculer pour mieux sauter, backing up a little before renewing an attack. He criticizes those who loudly call for a new order, arguing that they are often the most completely under the sway of the ideas which have created this war and most of the evils from which we suffer, and their proposals are often just a projection of the failed tendencies of the last 40 years, amounting to an attempt to imitate Hitler. Hayek addresses the younger generation, noting they are right to distrust the ideas of their elders, but are mistaken or misled when they believe that these are still the liberal ideas of the 19th century, which in fact the younger generation hardly knows. While he acknowledges that society cannot and should not return to the precise reality of the 19th century, we have the opportunity to realize its ideals. Hayek urges modesty regarding the past, asserting that the present generation has little right to feel superior to its grandfathers, as it is we, the 20th century, and not they who have made a mess of things. The ultimate guiding principle remains. The policy of freedom for the individual is the only truly progressive policy remains as true today as it was in the 19th century. The primary requirement now is to clear away the obstacles with which human folly has encumbered our path and to release the creative energy of individuals, rather than devising complex machinery for guiding and directing them. Hayek concludes that if the first attempt to create a world of free men failed, the effort must be renewed.